started.
Okay, I'll hit the live button, then everything after this should be live.
Okay. Hello, I'm Cynthia Shundle, and I serve as co-chair of the Social Work Advisory Committee of the Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. I asked the members of the advisory committee to respond to a roll call to signify their presence at this open meeting that is being conducted remotely by conference call and other electronic medium. My co-chair, Andrea Perdomo Morales. We can't.
Trying to find them. Yes.
Present. Sarah Behrens.
Present.
Thank you. Mary Gill.
I do see Mary on the call, but I believe she's muted right now.
Present.
Thank you, Mary. Mike Gillette.
And I don't see Mike on the call yet.
Angie Heller Workman.
Here.
Thank you. Jane Holtz Richter. Am I saying your name right?
Correct.
Thank you.
Here.
Thank you. Catherine Reck.
Present.
Eric Schonecker.
Present.
Thank you. Kristen Stice.
Present.
And I believe that's who we expected today. I note the following BSRB staff members are also present: David Fye,
Here.
Leslie Allen,
Here.
and Sammy Barksdale. Next, David Fye will read a message concerning this meeting being held remotely.
This is David Fye, Executive Director for the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. Public comment allows the public to address the advisory committee about its concerns, but the Kansas Open Meeting Act, or KOMA, does not require the advisory committee to provide public comment or answer questions from individuals. Individuals requesting to provide public comment could contact the executive director prior to the meeting by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov. There will be no public comment at the meeting, as no individuals requested to provide public comment. Because we are conducting this public meeting remotely by conference call and other teleconference ability, I state for the record the following information. Public access to this meeting is being conducted by a medium of interactive communication that allows members of the public without cost to attend the meeting through the use of the conference call and on the board's YouTube channel. While the meeting is conducted remotely, the requirements of the KOMA are not suspended. So we will be conducting this meeting pursuant to the KOMA. On October 28th, 2022, we sent notice of the advisory committee meeting to all individuals who had requested notice of advisory committee meetings. The notice was also posted on the board's website, ksbsrb.ks.gov. You may obtain a copy of the notice at that website. An agenda and other meeting material have been posted on the board's website and are available for review. You may also request a copy of the agenda by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov, and a copy of the agenda will be sent to you. The notice contains information for the conference call and YouTube channel that allows members of the public to attend the meeting free of charge. The notice also states that if there are any technical issues during the meeting, you may call the board office at 785-296-3240 or send an email to bsrb@ks.gov. A recording of the meeting will be available on the BSRB YouTube channel following the conclusion of the meeting by using the link to the meeting on the agenda. And while I was reading the introductory information, Mike Gillette has joined the meeting as well, so he is present as well.
Thank you, David. The meeting's now called to order, and the advisory committee will begin its discussion of the first item on our agenda. And that would be approval of the agenda. Has everyone had a chance to take a look at the agenda? Are there any additions anyone would like to request? Hearing none, do I hear a motion to approve the agenda?
I make a motion. This is Jane Holz-Richter.
Thank you, Jane. Do I have a second?
I second.
Thank you, Eric. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Nay. Thank you. The agenda is approved. And now we need to review and approve the minutes from our last meeting, which was on October 17th. Has everyone had a chance to look those over? David sent those to us with the meeting announcement. Are there any changes or additions to the minutes from October 17th? Hearing none, I would take a motion to approve the minutes as written. Anyone want to move to approve the minutes as written?
I'll move to approve them. This is Katie.
Second.
Thank you. Thank you, Katie. And a second,
I'll second.
Andrea? Oh, okay.
Or whatever.
Kristen. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. Any opposed? Okay, the minutes are approved.
Okay.
Now we'll move on to David's report, Executive Director's report.
Thank you, Cynthia. And just to make sure we have the minutes down correctly, it looked like maybe Kristen seconded the motion for the minutes. And so we'll make sure to have that in the minutes for you.
Correct.
I'll go ahead and provide some updates concerning recent activities by the BSRB and also some items from recent board meetings. There have been quite a few things that have occurred since the last Social Work Advisory Committee meeting. The board usually has a full day offsite planning meeting once a year, and the board held that meeting on October 24th, 2022. So I'll go ahead and start with those items. The board had a discussion about the review of certain applicant materials. For most of the applicants that apply to the BSRB, our staff is able to review those materials, but some individuals attended schools that are not accredited by the national accrediting body. Some individuals may have come from out of the country, and so their materials are a bit unique and have to be reviewed, in some cases by an expert that we hire to review those materials. The issue is that we have tried to use experts here in the state of Kansas, and based on the number of applications we receive, sometimes there can be some delay in that process. And so we have talked to the board about a company that can do some of those types of reviews called the Center for Credentialing and Education. And the board was receptive to the work that company can do and had them speak to the board to answer some additional questions at the November board meeting. And so we're going to be looking into possible RFP language to see if perhaps that group will be able to provide services to the BSRB so we can stay timely in our review of applications, not just the ones that are accredited by the national accrediting body, but those other unique applications as well. Additionally, the board has individuals that from time to time are denied for license because they do not meet the requirements in the program or the educational criteria for licensure. Those individuals are able to request an appeal on their decision, and the board had been utilizing the full board to hear those reviews for those applicants. The board elected to move to a model used by other agencies in which you have a hearing panel made up of board members. The board elected to go ahead and start using 5-member board panels, and the composition of those panels that would be for those hearings would include a board member for the profession that the individual was applying for, also a public member, and then the other 3 individuals would be other members of the board. Additionally, the board heard information about impaired provider programs, and these are programs that are utilized by some agencies outside of the state of Kansas, and there's also some agencies for other professions that utilize these programs. What the impaired provider programs do is usually 1 or 2 different services they provide. One would be a program that would be open for individuals who are licensed by the licensing body, but maybe struggling with substance use or perhaps mental health concerns, and they would be able to submit themselves to a program and receive services. In other cases, these programs are used as another disciplinary remedy for individuals when they are perhaps have violated a professional conduct regulation of the board or other statute or regulation. And this provides another remedy the board can use in exchange for another type of disciplinary remedy. And so the board was receptive to having an impaired provider program to begin that process to utilize a program. We will be looking at RFP language to see what groups are providing these types of services and what they would be able to provide. And so we're going to be walking down that path to walk towards maybe utilization of an impaired provider program. Additionally, the board had a conversation at that October 24th meeting concerning license requirements for the professions under the BSRB and also reciprocity requirements. The board discussed the current statutes that concern reciprocity requirements and also recent legislation that impacted reciprocity, such as a bill that passed during the 2021 session, which was primarily focused on military members, military spouses, but also included any individuals that reside in Kansas or those that intend to reside in Kansas. And the board had a discussion to see if perhaps the professions under the board could review their reciprocity requirements and license requirements to see, are there any changes that could be considered to address topics like workforce without endangering the public protection mission of the board. Additionally, the board held conversation on workforce and talked about that when you're concerning workforce topics, you're not just talking about individuals entering the profession from the beginning. Workforce is also composed of individuals that are currently licensed, and if we can provide any assistance to help those individuals stay licensed. And then also there are individuals that for one reason or another may have allowed their license to expire. And the board had a conversation to see if there might be ways the board could be assistive to individuals who had been licensed that may want to become licensed again. And the board discussed an approach that we're going to be pursuing that would allow individuals to reinstate their licenses, and an easier method. Right now, if you have an expired license and you wish to reinstate your license, you would need to show that you had completed all continuing education hours for the past licensure period. And then you would also need to pay essentially double a license fee, because you would be paying a license fee plus a reinstatement fee for your license to be reinstated. What the board is in favor of pursuing is a model in regulation that would allow for individuals to, if their license had been expired for over a year, they would be able to reinstate their license for just the license cost, not double the fee. And also they would be able to obtain a temporary license. This would be a special new temporary type of license that would allow them to begin to practice for a period no more than 6 months. While they are attaining those additional continuing education hours, they would need to fully reinstate their license. So they could begin to start providing services and start working under that short-term temporary license, finish their continuing education hours needed for their license to be fully reinstated. And then once those hours had been completed, they could ask for their license to be fully reinstated, and then it would become just a regular permanent license. So we think this would be a nice way that we could help individuals who wish to practice again and sort of reduce some of those barriers that may be preventing people from coming back and rejoining the workforce. Additionally, the board recommended changes for the behavior analyst profession. One of these has to do with the composition of the board. There are currently 12 members by statute on the board, 8 professional members and 4 public members. But when the behavior analyst profession was added, I believe back in around 2014, there was not statutory language to identify a board member for the behavior analyst profession. Those individuals who serve in the advisory committee had recommended to the board adding a board member for the behavior analyst profession, and the board was receptive to that. And so in statutory language, we'll be requesting this spring, we will be requesting that the legislature add a 13th member of the board for the behavior analyst profession. Additionally, the board was supportive of changes to statute to provide similar disciplinary remedies for the behavior analyst profession. When that profession was created, the language was different, and the traditional some of those traditional disciplinary remedies that are available in statute for the other professions, such as public censure and fines, are not available for the behavior analyst profession, which means that the remedies we do have are either significantly severe, or else there's no real moderate or minor disciplinary remedies. And so adding this language will allow better uniformity between the professions and will allow us to have ability to provide those types of disciplinary remedies when they are appropriate. Additionally, there were a few changes for the social work profession that the board had recommended. One was for the new creation of a temporary license. These would be for graduates from programs that are in candidacy for accreditation. So the board had received information about schools that are pursuing candidacy through the Council on Social Work Education, CSWE, but that candidacy and that accreditation process can take about 3 to 3.5 years. So it is possible for a new program to start, to be in the process of seeking accreditation, to be in candidacy in which they're meeting specific marks, which shows that they are fulfilling the requirements to become accredited. But if they are not fully accredited yet, when they apply to the BSRB, there's currently no language specifically addressing those individuals, aside from the regulations do provide an alternate pathway for licensure by meeting the requirements in regulation. However, we have talked with multiple states and looked at different methods, different statutes and regulations they have available for these applicants who apply from schools that are in candidacy for accreditation. And there was a model that the board is going to be recommending utilizing, which allows someone who attended a program that is in candidacy for accreditation to apply for a temporary license from the board that would last for a year. And at the end of that year, if their program still remains in candidacy for accreditation, the board would renew their license for another time period. And then once their program reached full accreditation, then the individual would be able to get a permanent license. And so we believe this will be a helpful way of allowing those individuals to be able to work under those temporary licenses, and will address that issue concerning those programs that are in candidacy for accreditation. Additionally, the Social Work Advisory Committee had recommended to the board statutory language for board-approved supervisors for the social work profession, and the board was supportive of that. And so that will be a measure that will be included in statutory language going before the legislature in the spring. Additionally, the Social Work Advisory Committee had recommended a requirement in diversity, equity, and inclusion and cultural competency as it related to continuing education for the profession. The board had a conversation, broad conversation about continuing education requirements across the professions. And I provided a memo to the board based on researching continuing education requirements for all the professions under the board and those in other states. And what was revealed was that for most of the professions in the BSRB, I believe all, have a requirement of 3 hours in ethics. And across other states, that is pretty uniform. Most states have a requirement of a certain number of hours in ethics. However, for the levels of license under the BSRB that are able to diagnose and treat, they are required to complete 6 hours of diagnosis and treatment in continuing education each licensure period. And that requirement is a bit unique compared to other states. And so as part of this conversation about whether to require hours in diversity, equity, and inclusion for continuing education, what the board decided to do is they decided to request language in statute that would be included in a bill this spring, in which they would decrease the number of hours for diagnosis and treatment from 6 hours down to 3. And they would add a new requirement of 3 hours in continuing education in diversity, equity, and inclusion and cultural competency. And then for those levels of licensure that do not have a requirement in diagnosis and treatment, they would have a new 3-hour requirement in the DEI category and cultural competency. And this would not be above the current number of total hours that those individuals would need every license period. It would just be within that set of continuing education hours. They would have to get 3 hours in ethics and then 3 hours in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then for those that are able to diagnose and treat, they would need to get 3 hours in diagnosing and treating. Then the board also made a recommendation for a change in the regulations for the professional counseling profession. Currently, the regulations allow for an individual applying for certain levels of licensure as a professional counselor to have received a degree in professional counseling or a related field. However, the requirements and regulation for the program require that the program be chaired or directed by an identifiable person who holds a doctoral degree in counseling. And the board recommended changing that to also allow the person who chairs or directs the program to have a degree in counseling or a related field, to better allow individuals who apply for licensure to meet the requirements for licensure. And also the board last year and earlier this year heard information on resolving an issue in which we have records from deceased practitioners or records that have become abandoned, and how the BSRB can be assistive in that process. What the board elected to do was to recommend adding language to the unprofessional conduct regulations for the profession, and noting that it would be unprofessional conduct for a practitioner to fail to have a custodian in place for their records should they be unavailable or pass away unexpectedly. And so that will be the first thing that we will be looking for in terms of adding language to the unprofessional conduct regulations for the profession. And then once that is implemented in the unprofessional conduct language, then we can pursue adding a question to the renewal application in which we can be assistive to those individuals. This is a problem that we have seen at a board level only about 2 or maybe 3 times a year. So it is a rare problem, but we were looking at a way that we could be assistive in this way. And I think establishing that it would be unprofessional conduct would be a helpful way for us to spotlight this issue, make it clear to professionals that it is their responsibility to make sure that their records would not fall into this category where it would be an issue for individuals not to be able to receive their records should they pass away unexpectedly and there's not a custodian, their records already identified. Additionally, the board met on November 14th, 2022, and made a couple of different decisions that I want to make you aware of. First, there was a presentation provided to the board on a professional counseling compact. This is a multi-state compact that has already been passed by about 15 to 20 different states. It would be for the clinical level of licensing for the professional counselors. And the board received information from the Kansas Counseling Association, and it was requested that the board be supportive of this compact if it is requested in legislation this spring. And so the board elected to take the time between the November board meeting and the January board meeting to research the compact more fully, and then perhaps to discuss the compact further at the January board meeting. Additionally, the board is able to appoint a member to serve on the Kansas Fights Addiction Grant Review Board. That board was created by passage of legislation during the 2021 legislative session, and the board had appointed me to serve as the board's representative on that grant review board. But the board determined that they would like to have an individual who had more experience treating addictions and more hands-on practice and expertise in that area. And so the board had opened that up to advisory committees, and anyone who met the requirements in the statute for that grant review board could submit materials for consideration. And the board elected to appoint, based on the individuals who had applied, the board appointed Jason Hess to serve as the new appointee on that Kansas Fights Addiction Grant Review Board. So we're really excited about the work that he will do on that group, and looking forward to him providing updates to the board on the work that he's doing with the Kansas Fights Addiction Grant Review Board. Additionally, the board is charged to not only take care of the regulation of licenses, but also the investigation of complaints against practitioners. And the board is guided by an investigation policy that is utilized by a subset of the board called the Complaint Review Committee. The board had been going through that investigation policy and making changes this past year, and they completed their changes at that November board meeting, and a clean copy of the policy will be provided back to the board at the January board meeting. Additionally, I spoke earlier about the board's efforts to support individuals who are currently licensed, and there is a regulation under the licensed psychology profession that is KAR 102-1-15G. It is exclusive just to the licensed psychology profession, but it allows those professionals, if they are licensed by the BSRB and they're coming upon their renewal deadline, if they have not completed the necessary continuing education hours, traditionally they would not be able to renew their license. But under that regulation, they could ask for an extension of more time to complete the hours. And if they could show good cause for needing that extension and they are approved by the BSRB, then they could receive the additional time and still continue to renew their license. We had talked about the details of that regulation to the advisory committees. The board was receptive of including that for the professions under the BSRB with some modifications. One would be to shorten the length of time available for them to complete those hours from 6 months to 3 months. Two, to make sure that individuals could not use it in back-to-back licensure periods, and also to change the standard from good cause to extenuating circumstances. So we will be moving forward on that language as well. And additionally, several professions under the board have recently voted on regulatory changes in terms of the education requirements for licensure. Many of the professions had included language that called for an in-residence requirement, which included that individuals who were not accredited by the national accrediting bodies would have to receive at least some of their education in residence while physically present at the universities. However, the professions of addiction counseling, marriage and family therapy, and the social work profession have recently voted to remove that physical presence requirement. And just recently, the Professional Counseling Advisory Committee also recommended that change so that regulatory language will be going to before the board at the January meeting to approve. And then I just want to make you aware of a couple of legislative updates. There is a joint committee on administrative rules and regulations that met and Leslie Allen and I attended that meeting and went through a number of proposed regulatory changes for the professions. The members of that committee were able to ask us questions and we reviewed all of those. Additionally, those proposed changes to regulations have been held open for a 60-day public comment time period. We did not receive any written comments or oral comments, and we had a public meeting at the board office for additional comments on November 8th, and we did not receive any comments. Those proposed changes to the regulations were published in the Kansas Register and on December 1st, and so they have now become effective, and we will be sending out a message with notice to all licensees about those changes, primarily concerning the clinical level of licensure for the professions, and specifically those individuals who are applying new to become clinical level practitioners. Additionally, tomorrow, there is a legislative committee that is focusing on mental health beds, and they are going to be meeting with representatives from a few different health regulatory agencies to have a roundtable discussion to primarily discuss issues related to workforce. So I'll be attending that meeting And I will be talking in regards to actions by the board and the advisory committees in that area. And then also the last thing I wanted to provide a comment on, I attended the annual meeting of the Association of Social Work Boards recently. And that was a very good conference. And one of the main topic areas that they spoke to at that conference was the examination release data and steps that the association is taking regarding examination data. As we had heard in some recent meetings, there was a report that was provided by ASWB, and there was discussion about disparities in terms of examination pass rates. And members of ASWB had talked about some other materials they had provided, including resources for educators and also task forces that have been started concerning that exam release data and changes to the examination. There were some additional comments made by representatives of ASWB that I thought were particularly interesting. They called for groups to work together on this issue and to come together to find solutions. One of the topics that they were talking about is that they're examining a lot of the previous requirements for the test itself. For example, the test had previously been a 4-choice multiple choice test, and they're transitioning through a 3-choice multiple choice test. They indicated that one of the options was not being picked very frequently, but when you had 4 options instead of 3, for some individuals, it became more of a speed reading test because you would still need to read through all of that material. And if they're really testing comprehension, then they saw no issue in looking at that as a possible way to be assistive in terms of testing what is really being tested by the examination. And they're also looking at other accommodations that people have requested to see if those things can be just made across the board in terms of, a lengthy test. Previous requirements that said you couldn't have a snack in the middle of those hours. Well, if you have low blood sugar, perhaps it would make sense that you could have a snack or something in the middle of the test. The area where you are able to leave your materials is being monitored as well. And so they're trying to loosen those types of requirements that are not going to affect the integrity of the test, but also try to think about perhaps other ways to make it more of a fair process. And so when I was sitting in that meeting, one of the things that I thought about was, if we're all being asked to look at this issue and try to be assistive, I wondered, is there anything that I could bring back to the advisory committee for us to discuss and that we could consider in terms of a way that we could be assistive in this process too? And I heard from individuals about different ways in which individuals can get continuing education hours. And one of the topics that's on the agenda for today is looking at the continuing education requirements under our statutes and regulations. And one thing that I discussed with the co-chairs prior to the meeting was perhaps looking at a proposal in which perhaps there's a way that we can look at counting continuing education hours for individuals who are providing mentoring services or coaching services to individuals that are struggling to take the examination or pass the examination. And perhaps those hours that they are spending to help those individuals pass the test, perhaps that's something the advisory committee could look at as a way to count those hours if they're documented and we know that they're assisting in that process, but perhaps it's something that we can do as a licensing body to be assistive in that process as well. So just wanted to prepare you for that item on the agenda, but it was a very good conference. I know that individuals are trying to look for different solutions and trying to be assistive, and lots of good comments and thoughts were put out there. So I understand that's a lot of information since there's been multiple board meetings and legislative meetings and everything else. So at this point, I'll go ahead and end my report and I can stand for any questions.
David, this is Jane. Did you say that on the old business, it may be new business, but discussion would be about for the ones that struggle taking a test, that there may be some change or movement that we can discuss on ways to improve that?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I've heard from different conferences across different professions is that there are traditional continuing education hours. Individuals go to hear a speaker or they take they listen to a lecture and they may have to answer certain questions. But then certain states have other, and we do as well, other ways that you can accrue a continuing education hours, whether you're writing a book or whether you're preparing to give an examination, or, preparing to give a lecture. There's alternative ways that you can accrue continuing education hours. And one thing I was thinking about was perhaps, there may be ways that individuals could be assistive in the social work profession by mentoring those who are struggling with the test. And perhaps, if they're spending that time working with someone who's trying to get licensed and struggling with the test itself, perhaps there might be a way that we could have a conversation as an advisory committee about looking at a certain number of hours, perhaps every license period, that if somebody wants to be a coach or a mentor and help those that are struggling with the test, perhaps we could allow a certain number of hours each licensure period, as long as they are documenting the hours that they're spending with the person or multiple people. And that could be a way that we could help, put a spotlight on that and help support those that are supporting others. So.
With all the changes that are happening, and we've just in a whole new age, did you hear anyone talk about grandfathering in on, let's say, the clinical side, not going in from the beginning, LMSW, but anyone talk about if you have been in practice for, and I'm just going to throw a number out there, like a decade, that can in lieu allow you to apply for a clinical license without going through the ASWB testing?
So are you speaking about someone who's been in Kansas the whole time, or someone coming from?
It would be from Kansas. It would be our state. Did any other states have anything like that? Or have you heard anything like that?
I'm not sure. I don't know that I've heard recent conversation on that. I know that there's several different states that are reconsidering their current reciprocity requirements, but I don't recall any specific conversation like you're discussing right now. It's very possible that there may be states that are having that conversation. I just don't recall something like that.
Jane, do I understand that you're asking whether someone who has been in practice for a certain number of years, not clinically licensed, could apply for their clinical license without having to take the test?
Right, where practice is versus the written test.
And as far as I understand, we don't have that option because it's in statute in Kansas, so it'd have to be a statutory change. But there have been how many states, David, that have suspended the test as a requirement because it must not be statutory in those states?
So I'm not sure how many states have suspended the examination. I know that earlier this year, I've heard that Illinois stopped requiring the exam. And for other states, I'm not 100% sure. I know that for at least some professions, there are states that would prefer that everyone reach the clinical level of licensure. And so it gets a little complicated because I know that there are some jurisdictions to where they really push individuals to get to the clinical level. So some of the lower levels of licensure may be treated as provisional or temporary in nature. And so for those, for some of the states that don't require licensure for certain levels, I'm not sure if those are ones that have it as a temporary nature or if those have it as, in Kansas, you could stay at any level of licensure for your entire career. And so there's a little bit of difference there. So I'm not sure how many states have removed the test. The one that I'm aware of was Illinois because that one was done earlier this year, but I'm not sure about other states. And I apologize, I heard someone beeping on the conference call. If you're on the conference call, could you identify yourself? Okay, well, if someone makes a comment on the conference call, I'll go ahead and let you know.
Okay, thank you, David. Any other questions, comments on the executive director's report? Okay, thank you, David. That was a lot to cover. Now we're going to move on to old business. And the first issue is to finalize the recommended changes in the unprofessional conduct regulations. Now, those changes were discussed before I came on board, so I'm going to ask David if he can give a brief summary of what those unprofessional conduct regulations are that we need to finalize.
Sure. Yeah, and Cynthia, this was one of those projects that I had asked each of the advisory committees to focus on this year. For some of the professions under the BSRB, the last time the unprofessional conduct regulations had been updated was around 2002. For the social work profession, the last time that any changes were made was around 2008. And so I had asked each of the advisory committees to take time this year to walk through those to see if there were any regulations that may have outdated language, if there were any items that were not covered in the unprofessional conduct regulations that maybe new language could be added, or maybe that there were some that it was time for those regulations to be removed. And so each of the advisory committees went through a process, and I appreciate the time that you spent as an advisory committee walking through those. I have gone through the minutes from the past meetings, particularly the minutes from the April and June meetings of the advisory committee. And I have highlighted a handful of items that you had either made recommendations on or you had highlighted for discussion. And additionally, this regulation of your unprofessional conduct is KAR 102-2-7. And so what I've done is I've put together an Excel table that I'll go ahead and share my screen and show you here. And primarily what I've done is put the existing wording of the regulation on the left side of the table, and then the proposed change language on the right side of the table. And there was one item the advisory committee did not discuss, but some of the other advisory committees under the board did discuss. So I wanted to highlight for you today. But if you have any other changes that you would recommend for the unprofessional conduct regulations, that can certainly be added to the list. My hope is that by the end of this meeting, we can finalize this list so that way it could be provided to the board. Ultimately, the advisory committee has the authority to make recommendations to the board, but it is the authority of the board to actually vote and make recommended changes to the unprofessional conduct regulations. So if the board elects to make changes, then those would go through the process to be changed. So let me share my screen, and I'll show you some of those items that were discussed for change to the unprofessional conduct regulations. So you should be seeing the Excel table now. The first item I thought I would go through on the left, there is not currently language for this, but the advisory committee members had noted the current unprofessional conduct regulations lack language concerning appropriate technology related to telehealth practice, and members expressed support for adding language on email, texting, and compliance with HIPAA for televideo services. Advisory committee members expressed support for updating language concerning technology standards based on changes in technology over time. So those were the comments that I took from the minutes of the past meeting. On the left, this is not current regulatory language, but this is language that had been considered by a past professional counseling advisory committee. And I wanted to provide 3 different possible unprofessional conduct regulations to see if you might be interested in adding these under yours, addressing these comments that were made. The first would be possible language that would say it would constitute unprofessional conduct to practice inappropriate boundaries with clients with regards to the use of social media, including but not limited to using a personal profile to connect or communicate with clients on any social media platform, or accessing a client's social media page without previous consent. So that would be the first possible one you could consider adding. The second one you could consider adding would that it would constitute unprofessional conduct to disclose confidential information through public social media. And another possible one you could add, if you were interested in doing so, would be that it would constitute unprofessional conduct if you were engaged in distance counseling, failing to fulfill the following requirements: informing the client of risks and benefits of distance counseling, disclosing the possibility of technology failure and providing alternative methods of service, detailing emergency procedures to follow when the counselor is unavailable, and taking appropriate steps to encrypt or ensure the security of confidential client information or any activity that protects confidential client information from risk of privacy breach. So these were items that were discussed by a past version of the Professional Counseling Advisory Committee. They have been distributed to a few of the advisory committees for, as a way to address some of the recent conversation on technology standards, perhaps things like social media. So I wanted to show you this language to see if you were interested in adopting any of these possible regulations in your unprofessional conduct standards.
So this was not already previously discussed and decided?
I did not see this in the minutes from the past meetings. It was originally intended to be part of the conversation for professional counseling. And so they were reviewing what past groups of the professional counselors had looked at. But then going through this process, I thought it might be helpful for other advisory committees to see this language as well. So I don't believe your advisory committee has discussed these before.
Yeah, we have.
Okay. I'm incorrect on that. I intended to distribute it, and I let some of them review this language, but I wasn't sure if you had reviewed it or not.
So Jane, what do you remember about what
Well,
discussion or any decisions that?
I don't think we made decisions. I would think we put it on hold, but we did discuss adding some of this language to our social work for ethics. We had looked at the ASWB, and we brought a couple of different methods in to look at, but I was on that ad hoc committee.
Yeah, and one of the tricky things too, a number of the advisory committees for different professions looked at language from associations. That the unfortunate thing is that there is a little bit of a difference between some of the associations put forward best practice language, and there is a difference between best practice versus unprofessional conduct, because some of the advisory committees said, well, if these things are the ethical standards of best practice, can we just say if you're not doing these things, then it's unprofessional conduct? But there may be some ground between best practices versus what would constitute unprofessional conduct. You know, there may be things that are preferred, but there's probably something in between that versus what would be a violation. So.
Well, and I agree with that, David, because best practice doesn't mean that it's adopted by everyone. It just means that at the current time, the majority is saying this is best practice.
Does anyone have any thoughts about in using this language for social work? I guess I have a little bit of a concern about rising it to the level of unprofessional conduct as well, because first of all, it's constantly changing. So if we set standards for what's good, what's unprofessional practice around technology, you know, what happens when the next level of technology change and it happens and this language is obsolete.
Is anybody in this committee in private practice? Because a lot of the language in these A, B, C, and D, those are things that even when you have your personal practice insurance, that they ask that you put into your documents that your clients sign before you provide services.
I was just looking at it, and in my private practice, in my informed consent, I put this in under informed consent under business practice, and then they sign it and date it, and then I sign it and date it.
I actually have a separate, you have the HIPAA document, then I have a separate one for telehealth services that outlines all of these, pretty much almost the same language verbatim. So I would assume that most people are doing that if they're performing those types of services.
Well, they don't all apply to telehealth necessarily. You know, just connecting with someone over Facebook or whatever could happen if you're seeing someone in office.
I'm talking about the A, B, C, D. Most of those are in distance counseling.
Sure.
Right. But I like B, and I'm not for sure that I've addressed B. I like it because so often you have that technology failure. You start out, you know, like on therapy notes, or I don't use Zoom because of the licensing, but and then if your connection's not real good, yours may be, but theirs may not, then, you know, what do? You know, do you finish it by phone and you see their face on therapy notes? You know, how do you deal with the finishing that session? So just having that conversation and having it there in the regulation and having that conversation with the client, I think is important too. So the two system encryption, that's beginning to be really popular for, the breach of confidentiality and things like that to protect it.
Mhm.
I don't know. I
Well,
like it.
It sounds
Mhm.
like we have a lot of agreement that these are good practices, best practices, but would we consider it unprofessional conduct not to follow them?
Well, I think in my opinion, on new language number 1, that would seem like unprofessional conduct to me. If we're going by the 1, 2, 3, I think number 1, that looks fairly obvious to me that would be unprofessional.
Number
Yes.
two,
And
I
number
think,
2.
falls into that same category.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And both of those would apply to whether you were seeing a client in office or via telehealth.
Mm-hmm. Or if you were even just a social worker not practicing mental health services.
Well,
Mhm.
and I think A supports number 2. Because we should inform clients of risk and benefits.
I see those as 2 different things. I think number 2 is like being somebody's friend on Snapchat when you're their case manager and you're snapping pictures to kids and they're snapping them back to you. That's how I see the social media piece, different than the counseling piece.
I mean, we already have, I think there's already language about informing clients of risks and benefits in general
Mhm.
Mhm.
in the unprofessional conduct regs, isn't there? This defines it more specifically as regards telehealth, but I think it could be considered, I guess there could be some value in articulating that piece of informed consent. Because there are some unique risks to distance counseling.
Yeah, I understand that the technology can change, but since it is so new, I like number 3 because it does give, if you're new to this area, it gives you some baseline of what you need to be looking out for, and some guidelines around that to make sure that you're hosting a professional session with your patient or client.
Do we know if there's an NASW standard on this issue? I haven't researched that. David, do you know?
I'm not sure.
I guess I'd like to see that.
And if there's not a consensus today,
This is Mike.
go ahead, Mike.
I think
This is
we lost
Mike.
him. He's there.
I didn't mean to interrupt you, Dave. Okay, thank you. I have a really bad connection today, I think, and so I'm sorry if it's not working. It seems like all these items will be covered simply in an informed consent disclosure that someone just has to sign. And I think it's the intent of what this is what's important. And so I think legally, it'll just be a clause or a page that people can easily sign, and they will. But then that opens the door to the Snapchat that was mentioned down below. I'm by one of the other members. And some things really don't seem to be appropriate, in a professional relationship. And I'm not sure if that's what we're trying to get at in these statements, but the way I see this, I just think it's consent, or is it saying specific consent to a specific occasion? It's not saying that. Um, I think we got to do something but at the same time, this doesn't seem very, very strong. That's my comment.
So you think the language needs to be stronger, Mike?
I think it's difficult to be stronger. You know, I'm just identifying that it seems like a lot of words and a lot of work that may not necessarily help people to be more professional in their practice. So I'm not sure what the answer is. I'm not saying that we need more words necessarily, but um,
Well, I think
I just know
Andrea,
the practice that I'm in, the organization has much stricter rules than this. And
right. So this is a rather basic and kind of mild approach to setting some standards for dealing with technology. And as Andrea said, it could be a jumping off point for new practitioners to shape how they practice and to make sure that they're aware of at least some of these beginning issues or basic issues around technology. If we were to adopt this language, which is basic and as we're saying, and someone violated these, then putting it into the unprofessional conduct means that someone could make a formal complaint based on the practitioner having not followed these. Correct?
That's correct.
and I would say I agree to that. That is a good statement. Yes.
So is this something that we want to take a vote on at this point, or do we feel like we need more information? Or, oh, Angela, I see your hand up.
Yeah, we had to look up some information because we're looking at changing some telehealth options in some of our waiver programs. And so I looked up, there's standards for technology and social work practice with the NSAW partnered with like ASWB, CSWE, and CSWA to kind of develop a uniform standard for technology. And I just would like to say that I think we should look at that as well
Absolutely.
as a point of reference. So we're not creating something that's not already being used as a note practice wise across the board. So
Yeah, we don't need to reinvent the wheel.
yeah.
If they have some standard language that we might adopt, I think that's definitely worth looking at. David, would you be able to get that to us?
Yeah, and I think I might have already provided that to the advisory committee earlier this year. So I think I could go ahead and provide a copy of that again. And so I think, you know, and this does not have to be the only time that we adjust these unprofessional conduct regulations. I was interested in making sure that there were some that had been forwarded to the board, but I know that's going to be at least one advisory committee that won't be able to send recommendations for this January meeting. And so I think this is something that we could probably talk about in more detail at the February meeting to finalize recommendations, and then those ones could be provided at the March meeting. So
I think if I can just add
I'd like to
on.
mention,
Oh, go ahead.
Jane and I served on that ad hoc committee to try to look at these things. We did review those materials you're talking about, Angela. We thought they were excellent. We should adopt them. But we were advised at the time that we couldn't just adopt what those policies or what those statements were into our way of saying it. Like David has said, the executive director has said, want to maybe modify something or add something in addition, it could make things sharper. But maybe Jane has a comment because she was in the middle of all that as well.
No, Mike, you said it correct, that we couldn't just adopt their language that was written, that we needed to change the wording or somehow make it ours for the state.
Yeah, I
And
think-
that, and
yeah.
why was that?
So I think the main issue was you don't want to say that we're going to abide by this group's policy, because then if they change it in the future, then you essentially are yielding your authority to a group that you have no control over. So you can use the actual text.
That's what I meant.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you just don't want to say that we're going to follow this group's policy, because then you lose some authority there.
Well, and they could change the policy then. So, but yeah, what I was wondering was, can't we use their language without saying we're going to follow NESW's guidelines, whatever they are? So that would be an option.
I think it would be if we changed a little bit of the language, but to take it verbatim from theirs is probably not kosher.
Well, I think it'll be good then for us all to look at that again. And it sounds like that this will be some rehash of some work that's already been done. But I'm not hearing that we're ready to take a vote right now on this particular regulation. So if we can take the time to look at that policy that I understand you've already looked at, and maybe in February, we would be able to decide what we want to modify, if we want to use that language, or if we want to go with this, it sounds like less detailed language in what David has up on the screen right now. The
And we're still
NESW
able, I'm sorry, are we still able to get that into legislation if we do that in February?
So these changes to unprofessional conduct are in the regulations, so they can be submitted anytime during the year.
Okay, good deal.
The statutory
Not
changes
statutory.
into a bill, but yeah, regulatory changes, we have more flexibility on when those are submitted. So
I support then that we look at it maybe one last time in February and make a decision.
okay. Well, Cynthia,
Is everyone else okay with that? Any
It's okay with me.
objections? Okay,
sounds
that
like
sounds like the plan. Go ahead, David.
okay. Would you like me to go through the other recommendations and?
Yes,
Okay.
please.
All right. So there was a conversation on item L in the unprofessional conduct regulation, which said it would be unprofessional conduct to discriminate against any client, student, or supervisee on the basis of color, race, gender, religion, national origin, or disability. And it was discussed by the advisory committee members that the different items that were identified do not match the list recognized in the Code of Ethics. So I went ahead and looked in the NASW Code of Ethics, and at least when they discuss cultural competency, there are references to race, ethnicity, national origin, color, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, age, marital status, political belief, religion, immigration status, and mental or physical disability. And so one thing that you could do is we could use this language to be modifying item L, if that was something the advisory committee would be supportive of.
Well, that's much more comprehensive. I would not have a problem with adopting the Code of Ethics language. What does anyone else think?
I agree.
This is Leanne, I agree.
Do we need to take a formal vote on that, David?
No, as long as there's consensus, then we can go ahead and move forward with those ones. So I guess I would say that, you know, let's just say that when we go through these, if there appears to be consensus, we can move forward. And if anyone objects, they should go ahead and vocalize that, because it's hard to see hands a little bit when we're showing the screen this one. So.
And were there any objections or anything that anybody thinks should be added to that list? Okay, sounds like we have consensus.
Okay. For item Z, it said it would be unprofessional conduct to make sexual advances towards, engage in physical intimacies or sexual activities with, or exercising undue influence over any person who within the past 24 months has been one's client. There was some advisory committee members who expressed support for changing the standard in that regulation from 24 months to never having sexual relationships with clients. I don't know that there was an official recommendation, but that was the conversation. And so I wanted to bring it up to see if there was interest from the advisory committee with actually changing this regulation. I can tell you that some of the other advisory committees have discussed this. Some of them are in favor of moving to a standard of 0, but I think at least half have decided that 24 months should be the acceptable standard. Not that anyone is in favor of this practice, but I think there are some logistical issues when you go to a standard of never. From a board perspective, I think it could create some challenges just because someone may have abided through the regulations when they were 24 months. And then if they're changed to never, you could have somebody submit a complaint based on the new standard. That might make it a little challenging for us to work through those things, just to think about from the board perspective in terms of looking at those. But since there was not an official recommendation, I just kind of wanted to highlight for you to see if you wanted to make a change from the 24-month standard to the never standard, or if you wanted to have that remain at 24 months.
David, this is Jane. Would it be possible if we time-stamped it and we dated it as of, and then that is therefore from this time forward? So that would take care of any of that past. Because I don't know what 2 years matters, in all honesty. I mean, we were all kind of surprised that we even had that standard in place, and apparently.
There should be a way, I would think, that we can go from this date forward. This is what it's going to be, because I feel like that you would have an unfair advantage over a client. You've got a therapeutic or some kind of relationship there, and then I don't think should happen. I really don't. It's my opinion.
I always espouse never with the people that I supervise, because when you end the therapy relationship, theoretically the door could remain open for that client to come back at a later time.
Right.
And if you cross a line at any point, I mean, I had clients that came back off and on over 20 years. And, if at any time you cross the line and have a personal relationship with that person, then you cut off that option that you can, of all the work that you did and whatever they carry of that work, that gets spoiled, and you're no longer that resource as a therapist. Plus, I think it would be problematic to have what any of us would consider a really healthy, equal relationship, personal relationship with someone that you'd had a therapy relationship with in the past.
Right.
What if it was somebody you had a brief interaction with, maybe saw once or twice? You didn't really do any deep clinical work. You just saw them once or twice. And then this is a scenario. This isn't me. I'm just throwing it out there. But then you met him a couple of years later, and there's attraction there, and you made a connection that you had seen each other in that way, maybe just for an intake or 1 or 2 sessions. Would that rule still apply in that situation? Because there are people who get therapy 1 or 2 sessions just for, EAP or just a quick, touch point. It's not always, long-term relationship.
I think if we're going to do it, we need to do it where it's clean. It's either or. I think once you establish a relationship, even if it's 1 or 2 times, you've established rapport and you gathered information. It's not so much us, it's what they are giving us in gathering information. And they're telling us a lot about family dynamics and things that are very personal. And I think there is an unfair advantage.
I think though we're assuming that everyone seeks out therapy or services for negative things about themselves. And I don't think that's always the case.
But I don't think we can make that determining factor, you know.
Well, yeah, that's what I'm saying too. I'm just saying, it feels like saying you can never have a relationship with somebody because maybe you did an intake with them or had them once or twice while they talked about the death of their grandmother or something. That seems harsh to me. That's just my opinion.
You
Well,
also have people who come in for assessments with like IQ, or where you don't really necessarily interact with them as much as you just perform a clinical assessment like a Milan or something like that. That might be different, but I also remember this conversation, and the semicolon on the end of Z is what brought me to this, but doesn't the full statute say client, student, supervisee, the whole works? Like, wasn't there a list of people that if you provided any of those or supervisory over any of those, that they all were lumped into the same category?
You're right.
No, so I think that there was a similar one that was item Y. And that was that it was unprofessional conduct to make sexual advances towards or engage in physical intimacies or sexual activities with one's client, supervisee, or student. And that one talked about essentially an active relationship. So if they are presently your client, supervisee, or student, that is a prohibited action. This one talks about specifically clients, and it says there has to be a gap of 24 months if someone pursues a sexual relationship and establishing what would be unprofessional conduct. So one has to do with when they are your current client, supervisee, or student, and then the other one is just specific to client and talks about a gap of 24 months from a former client.
In the psychologist, don't they have 0 on theirs? Where they cannot engage, they never can engage.
I think they're
When
24
I went
months.
through graduate school, it was 7 years for psychology, but that's been a multitude of decades, so it could have changed since then, but 7 was kind of the magic number when we went through.
Yeah, and
This is Leslie. I don't believe any, excluding behavior analyst, I don't believe any of ours stay forever. They're all limited to 24 months to 5 years, maybe.
Okay. I was told by a psychologist that it was never for them. So
It could be in their code of ethics, but it's not in our
Oh.
regulation.
that's right.
Right.
You're right, Leslie. That's where it's at.
Why would those two be different though?
Well, we're just looking at the one we just talked about is an example of where our code of ethics is different than what's in the unprofessional conduct standards.
It may have changed since the last time they updated unprofessional conduct, or, the past board members may have felt that wasn't appropriate or something.
Well, I'm not hearing consensus about either way.
Yeah, so I think on this one, since there wasn't an official recommendation, I think it would remain what's currently in for the language for item Z, unless you wanted to make a recommendation that was different. So,
Do we think that we'd feel any differently about it if it was longer than 24 months? If it was 5 years or 7 years? Does that seem any cleaner? not hearing any response to that idea as a middle ground. So
Do we have a large
I'm
number
thinking.
of complaints cases occurring frequently?
I supervised one guy who had gotten involved with his client
Uh-huh.
and been disciplined.
I know of a case that it happened, and they married and
Mhm.
it caused a divorce. I mean, it caused a divorce, then they married, let me put it that way. And they were all professional people. All of them were.
I mean, I think things like that happen in every profession. I'm just wondering if that we have a high incident of it in Kansas. Of
Was,
people getting-
isn't that the most number one cause of a lot of the complaints? Is my understanding.
Yeah.
Well, I know that we do see some of these from time to time. I believe the number one cause of complaints is probably technical violations. Someone maybe who was just short on their continuing education hours, or failed to renew their license, and a certain amount of time passed where they were still practicing but hadn't renewed their license in a timely manner. So I think those technical out of the way, but I think this is something that we do see with some regularity, or at least allegations of something.
So, and I'm sorry, David, I'm looking on the NASW 1.09 under sexual relationships, and I'm not seeing anywhere where it says 24. So are we saying the left-hand column is, I'm trying to open up the spreadsheet, sorry, more
Yeah, so the left-hand column is the existing language in regulation.
in regulation, okay.
Yeah. And then on the right were the comments from the minutes or the past discussions by the advisory committee. So, and then on the left, if there's not language or it was something new that I'm bringing forward today, I tried to put new in front of it so you would know that it was either new language for a specific regulation or one that had not been discussed previously.
Yeah, if I'm reading the NASW code, it says social workers should not engage in sexual activities or sexual contact with former clients because of the potential for harm to the client. So I'm not seeing any kind of time frame. It just says you should not.
That's NASW that we're talking about, the statutes.
Yeah, no, I understand, but I would just wonder why they would differ. Because if you're adhering to the statutes, you would want to also adhere to your code of ethics, and that they wouldn't conflict.
Well, and these regulations were last updated back in 2008. So it's possible that, standards may have changed at the national level since then, or it's possible that there may have been some effort to have uniformity between the professions. We are a composite board, so there are several different professions. So maybe there was a thought by the board several years ago to try to have similar standards to avoid confusion and then professional conduct regulations. I'm not sure, because we do go back quite a ways from the last time any of these were modified.
Also, Andrea, while the board looks at the code of ethics, we can't discipline based on the code of ethics. So really all the board looks at is unprofessional conduct. And if it differs from the code of ethics, that's between the social worker and their association involvement. We can't do anything with the code of ethics.
That was going to be my comment, is that you could actually not be a member of NASW, and that code of ethics, I don't think necessarily applies if you're not a member.
It is considered the standard code of ethics for social workers across the country, but it's not. So we want it to guide what is in regulation, even though in and of itself, the NASW code of ethics, is not something that you can complain to the state, to the BSRB, if someone violates it.
Right.
But I think Andrea's point was, we like for the regulations to match what our national code of ethics is as much as possible. And I think that's true in the other professions as well.
And Cynthia, with you saying that as well, I think too, how I'm reading this is also looking like at sexual harassment, which we're seeing more and more situations come up. And I think in sexual harassment, is where it's talking about exercising undue influence over any person or any kind of sexual acts, or that's kind of to me sounds like harassment as well. So I don't know if we should include something like that wording of, harassment isn't, tolerated as well. I mean, I'm just asking you guys, I don't know. Because I think I see more situations where people get harassed sexually than I do see people actually having the act,
Do you mean by professionals that have,
yes, like,
that are treating them?
Yeah.
Or serving them in some way?
yes.
Which would be a lot like workplace violence.
But they have they do have a, I think 1.11 sexual harassment is social workers should not sexually harass clients. Sexually harassment includes sexual advances, sexual solicitation, requests for sexual favors, and other verbal, written, electronic, or physical contact of the sexual nature.
And that's for existing clients, what you're reading.
Yeah, shouldn't harass clients, yes.
So what we're talking about here is former clients.
Right.
So we would
But does
need
it say former? Where does it say former?
if for any person who within the past 24 months has been one's client, has been. So the earlier one that David mentioned addresses current clients, people you're currently serving. But
So
this one is in regards to former clients, I believe. Yes, David?
Yes, that's correct. Yep, the other one was more about active clients, students, and supervisees, and this is really more directed towards former clients.
I mean, you shouldn't sexually harass
Someone anyway, even if they were your client, like, don't go back and hit them up. I mean, I don't know. I don't know. Sorry. I'm reading
Exactly.
myself.
So does anyone think that any of that more specific language describing harassment should be added in to the existing, if we're not gonna say anything beyond the 24 months, do we feel the need to add more specific language about sexual harassment in addition to what's already there?
I think maybe we could put having sexual relationships or sexually harass a former client.
Does anyone else think we want to add that phrase in some way to this regulation?
I was even wondering if it could be ZA, where it stands alone.
Yeah, that would be good as well, because it's definitely, I think it needs to be addressed, because the other one is for current clients, and wants to stop somebody from sexually harassing a client afterwards.
Folks, how about as a possible solution, how about something that would say making sexual advances towards, including but not limited to, sexual harassment, engaging in physical intimacies or sexual activities, or undue influence over any person who within the past 24 months has been one's client.
Well, that sounds perfect.
And then adding some similar language under Y that would say making sexual advances towards, including but not limited to, sexual harassment or engaging in physical intimacies or sexual activities with one's client, supervisee, or student.
That sounds
Right.
perfect.
Yeah.
Do we need to define sexual harassment as Lee read that definition, or do we?
Defined by the statute.
That's in the what you read was from the statute?
No, I'm just saying the sexual harassment would be defined by statute, Kansas statute. Because there's clear definition on abuse, harassment, and all of that.
Yeah.
Well, I heard several people in favor of that. Does someone want to make a motion to add sexual harassment to both Z and I believe you said it was Y, David, that referred to current clients?
Correct.
This is Lee. I'll make a motion to add sexual harassment to Z and Y.
Yes.
I
Do I hear-
second it.
Okay, Angela, second. Is there any discussion, further
I just want to
discussion?
clarify. So are we leaving 24 months?
I think that was where we landed because there's not agreement that I didn't hear consensus that we should change that
Right. I think that's where we're at.
either to 0 or to some interim length of time. So we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion on adding sexual harassment to these two regulations? Okay, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Nay. Okay, the motion carries.
Okay, so the last item was item W, and this is actual language in the regulations, engaging in professional activities, including billing practices and advertising involving dishonesty, fraud, deceit, or misrepresentation. For the other professions, when they went through this, this was one they had highlighted. Essentially, the idea is that we don't believe when these regulations were written that it was meant to only include billing practices and advertising, but that those were highlighted. And so the new language could say engaging in professional activities, including but not limited to billing practices and advertising involving dishonesty, fraud, deceit, or misrepresentation. So the only change would be to add in that it does include these two, but it's not intended to only include these two. I thought this would be a helpful one, and I thought I'd bring it towards you to see if the advisory committee was supportive of it.
That seems like an easy one to go with.
It sounds good to me. I think it should be added.
Anyone else?
I agree.
Any objections? Okay, sounds like we have consensus on that one, David.
Okay, great. Well, I will go ahead and mark these up, and I'll go ahead and distribute that document so the advisory committee can continue discussions, looking for some language, perhaps at either social media or telehealth practices for the February advisory committee meeting. So,
Okay.
Great.
I
Thank
would
you.
also just add in there that I don't know that there was consensus one way or the other for the time limitation on sexual relationships. So if that can still be left open.
To just further discussion. Yes.
Okay.
I would love to hear what the social workers would think on that. Just, as a whole. I don't want to add a survey just to be adding it, but it'd be interesting to see the feedback.
I also just want to note that on the NASW Code of Ethics, sexual relationships is highlighted in purple. Out of all of the things that are on this page, that's the only one that's highlighted.
Pretty strong point in the Code of Ethics. Mary, are you wanting to? You're muted.
I got
There
a
we go.
strong feeling about this. As an educator, it's, to say, well, you can do it, if it's past 24 months, then it's okay. For me as an educator, it is easier. It's all or nothing. It's easier when you're teaching students coming up and you want people to understand something. It's easier to say, you don't do this. You never do this. And so that's why I do feel pretty strong about this, that I appreciate what you're saying about the time frames. And if we could find a way to say this happened after such and such a time, but moving forward, there's no place for this. And it's just easier. It's easier to teach students that way. That's what I would say.
Yeah, I think it's just having a number in there of a certain number of months. yeah, it does kind of send the message that somehow magically after 24 months, then all the concerns that we would have about you having a personal relationship with a client just disappear. And we know that's not true. But the issue is, do we make it an unprofessional conduct standard, which then people can be, complained against about, because we know it does happen. And of course, if the relationship goes sour, that leaves the practitioner open then to an after the fact complaint of unprofessional conduct, however long down the road that might be.
I like to propose, like, if we did have to keep an year or something and didn't go 0, never do it, is like 10 to 12 years, something that's more substantial. So it's going to really defer people from really thinking in 2 years. Like, I think 2 years is too little. So anyways, like, make it like unobtainable. I don't know.
Well, right. If it's been 10 years since you saw that client.
Yeah. So it's a good enough time, and, phases in people's lives. There's enough, maturity, or I don't know. Anyways, I'm going back to mute.
Anyone else have a thought about that, about the 10-year idea, or a longer period?
I can accept that better.
I do agree. I mean, I think I personally feel like the never would be the best. However, I just wonder, for the investigation purposes, if you have a date and it says, how easy or hard is it to prove that you were in that relationship prior to the change? Or, I just think from that investigation purpose, it may be difficult to prove that you had a pre-existing relationship before the dates were changed, to say either never or for 10 to 12 years. So I just wonder how much the ability of those who are actually investigating have to get actual fact.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if that's maybe what's played into why it hasn't changed.
Yeah, practical problems in enforcing it. Yeah. Well, it sounds like we're not ready to land on a definite decision at this point, but I think we'll keep it on the agenda and discuss it further at our next meeting, perhaps. And in the meantime, if we don't do a formal survey, talk to the social workers, and ask them, see what we can do with an informal survey of our own, and any other information that you might be able to gather about best practices in this area. Okay, moving on, we are going to a discussion on the possible regulation for care of clients in crisis. And this has to do with whether people leave a voicemail on their office voicemail that tells clients, if they are in crisis, to call 911 or call 988 or go to the ER, versus having a specific arrangement with someone that you can send your clients to, where that they will be taken care of in an emergency, versus the old practice of carrying a pager or having an answering service and being on call yourself all the time. So Andre and I have talked about this a little bit, but David, was there a specific recommendation about this that was landed on at any point?
No, I think the board, asked the advisory committees if they could discuss this topic and potential language that may be an unprofessional conduct regulation addition. I've looked through your unprofessional conduct regulations to see if there's anything that could be, similar to this. And the only one that I saw that I wanted to highlight is item NN under your unprofessional conduct regulation, which is KAR 102-2-7. And NN says failing to seek continuation of service or abandoning or neglecting the client under or in need of professional care without reasonable arrangements for that care. So, you could use this if you wanted to make that argument that it would affect what you just talked about in terms of away messages that say, if you're in an emergency, call 911 or call 988. But the question, I think, is this existing language enough for practitioners to know what their responsibility would be in terms of assisting clients that are in crisis after hours? So I wanted to highlight this because it is currently in your unprofessional conduct regulations. If you had some additional language you wanted to add to this, addressing the topic that you talked about, or if there was potentially new language, that could be something the advisory committee could discuss. But I want to make sure that you were aware of this unprofessional conduct regulations at the start of this conversation.
Well, the question would be is, referring them to 911 or 988 or the ER, would that be considered neglect, or is that a reasonable arrangement for their care?
Mm-hmm.
So what are your practices, those of you that are seeing clients?
I would
What do
say
you
that,
do for-
I would say like the local community mental health center is an important contact besides just 988.
Well,
Because
we
they're
have-
supposed, huh? I'm sorry.
Yeah, like here at Fort County, we have a crisis that people can call when
Okay.
when the office is closed.
And from Horizons, we tell them if they cannot reach crisis to call 911. So it's just an automatic.
Yeah, I think as part of this conversation too, the board discussed, is it an acceptable practice that if you're not available to assist your clients, should you be able to identify another body that could provide service, like a local community mental health center, or would you need to have a more formal arrangement with that particular provider? Part of that conversation had to do with, you know your clients and you understand maybe the best way to provide services to them, whereas another body may not be able to assist them as effectively. And is it an okay practice for you to voluntarily assign that group to take care of your clients if you haven't made an arrangement with them specifically? So I think those were also part of the conversation here too.
Which, if that's the case, then again, it needs to be put in like an informed consent, right? Where they sign that they have knowledge that these are the practices if someone's in crisis.
Yes, whatever. I think that has to be a part of your practice statement, certainly in private practice. And, I always had someone that covered for me when I was gone, and in my informed consent, my clients would know that and would sign so that I could share information with my colleague about any clients that she might need to see when I was unavailable. You aren't going to have that with the mental health center. You aren't going to have that with 911 or 988 or the ER. And so, I'm just thinking of it from a client's perspective. If they're in crisis after hours and they're being, a voicemail tells them to call those other places, I'm doubtful they will. Whereas if they know I have an individual that covers for me when I'm unavailable, and this person, will know how to get a hold of me and will be able to share information, I think that feels a lot more personal to the client. They're a lot more likely. I did have people who, it didn't happen very often, but I did have people who would call my colleague and see her when I was unavailable. But I don't know how often that happens with those other referral sources. What is you all's experience with that? With how often people actually go to that alternative?
Ours uses the crisis, which we also do after hours. We roll it over and we have a contracted system in place too that answers. But for the most part, the people that are in crisis, they utilize it. It also determines on what's a crisis,
Right.
But we see them utilize it. We have a lot of people that go to the hospital, to be screened because of their crisis. So I would say it works for the most part in private practice. I'm always available. I do that even in my work here. I just always answer the phone. So you make me think. So I think it's two different entities that we're really talking about.
I think
Well,
that's a good point, Jane, that I think for organizations, it's because of the other standards, whether HRSA or, you know, other certification models, you have to have some of those outlined, but it's when you get into private practice that I'm not sure that there's a standard, or that many private practice clinicians make themselves available 24/7. But I'd be curious to hear what those that are in private practice and what the standard is.
Well, I was just looking at SAMHSA. They have a national guideline for behavioral health care best practice, national guidelines for behavioral health crisis care best practice toolkit. And it was posted April 28th, 2022. And I wonder if this is supposed to help assist states and communities with the development and implementation of effective crisis services and systems. And I thought maybe it might be something we could look at to see if we liked it, you know, and how it could correlate to our state of Kansas. But
well, I think what we have to struggle with on this very specific question is it appropriate care for anyone, whether it's an agency or a private practitioner, to refer clients to these crisis services, if you will, 911, 988 ER, community mental health center crisis lines. Is that a reasonable plan of care? If it is, then we don't need a regulation that says that it's not.
You know, from the looking at the suicide. So if we were to take it to the risk of what we know happens, if we didn't make that recommendation, that holds us liable. And that opens the door for many things that could happen. So I think we do have to add, you know, look at it like this. If your house was burning and you weren't home, you would expect somebody to make that call to emergency services to put the fire out.
Well, yeah, I don't think there's any question that we're obligated to provide some kind of care for clients in crisis after hours. It's a matter of what the regulation or what the unprofessional conduct standard should be for what constitutes reasonable care in that situation.
Well, and I personally don't think that it's probably realistic to say that any practitioner is available 24/7. Yeah, you may answer your phone in the evening. Yes, you may answer your phone on weekends, but there are going to be times, regardless of profession, where you're just simply not available. Let's say you're traveling and you're in a dead zone. So I think having those, that's better than nothing, which is kind of what Jane was talking about. Is I think you have to say, you know, bottom line, here's these national things. We're going to provide you all these supports and services within the practice, but failing those, here's sort of the last ditch effort to save you.
So do we need a regulation or?
Well, it's not really defined at all now. It's just reasonable care. So the question is,
umbrella.
Do we feel we need to define reasonable care?
Maybe define that we need to, you know, make it available services, leave a message of available services they can access in the area. That way you're not leaving them out there on their own, and we have that choice to make that phone call.
I think you also would have to define at that point what is reasonable care for each client, because what if your client's in a cell phone dead zone and you offered them a 988 option and they can't call? I mean, we would have to then identify what considers reasonable care. So I like the idea that it's vague because, like you guys said, the client, what they have access to, what their ability is going to be in crisis. I mean, somebody in crisis may not have the ability to think that rationally. So I like the idea of leaving it more general and up to the practitioner, but that's me.
I agree with that.
Because each situation is unique in its own way. The client's unique, each situation's unique. So
I just think that, all of you guys provide such professional services and things that you probably would have, your own crisis management plan of how you want to deal specifically for certain situations for your, clients or consumers that we are in touch with. So, maybe just those, like the call crisis centers in real time, people who can talk with somebody, and then like the mobile crisis units, knowing that they're available, and then just other things like that. So if you have consumers, you probably already mentioned that as an option for them. If you're not, you hope to be there, but you're not always going to be available.
right.
These are other options that you have to reach out to for additional supports and stuff. So I think if you have that in place, then you probably have yourself covered as a consumer looking in.
Well, there's a question of whether you're covered in terms of, legally, and whether we're providing appropriate care. And, I had a half page of resources that were part of my practice statement, so that people had that in writing, in addition to then, if they were in crisis and they called, being able to get some direct referrals. But so, that may be part of what we consider reasonable care too, is how much, because if somebody's in a dead zone, they can't call you either,
Right.
to get referrals at that point. They need other resources that maybe they've been handed in black and white.
Yeah, I myself, I make sure that they get one of our crisis cards whenever they come in the office, whenever they do an intake or first time I see them. And I ask them every so often and say, even if they're not suicidal or anything, because it does for intakes for otherwise for crisis. So.
Well, I'm not hearing any appetite to establish standards for what is reasonable care for clients in crisis. Am I hearing that correctly?
Yeah, I think it's situational.
And we don't want to nail down a specific standard that practitioners would be held to across the board.
Well, I think it's different. What different practices has different guidelines as well.
Yeah, this is Mike. I know working with federal government, they have a very specific statement we have to put on our answer machine that I think is rather annoying. And it goes through all the 911, all those things. And they dictate to us what we have to put on there. We don't have a choice. And I think that's a little bit what Lee was saying too, is that your agency may dictate what you can place. I think best practice, as you have mentioned, is wonderful. I'm looking at Cynthia. We have that as well, but that doesn't mean on the phone or in that emergency they reach out, they get this rather choppy phrase type statement that is I don't think is helpful, but we have to do it.
What if we looked at, I was just thinking, what if we looked at if we put something together and we identified that organization or private practice, so that we encompassed it all, has to have some type of a crisis care plan to inform, and we leave it more broad so that organizations and private practice
that would be
clinician understand it, but they need to know, again, thinking of brand new people coming in, they need to know. And then we have the toolkit with some of these samples on the BSRB website for them to utilize. I mean, we put regulations in place, but we need to additionally help people with a toolkit. So this is what it would look like.
Here's some examples of how
Right.
other practitioners are covering this need. I like that idea.
This is Leslie, I'm gonna be the downer, of course. In the past, we've been told we can't put things like that on our website because it's coming from the board and it implies that this is required, this is what you have to do.
Okay.
That we can only stick to our statutes and regs.
Okay, so Leslie, I'm going to ask this question then, because working with grants and the governors, through the government, there's always a little clause that talks about may not agree, that is stated on all of our information. Why could we as a BSRB advisory or not say this may not support, the language, but these are samples. We give more than one because more than one shows that you are not confined to doing it one way. But we have to help social workers grow too and have access. We talk about access to care, but we need access to practitioners, ability to perform too. So do you think that would be something that we could ask?
You could certainly ask. We tried to do that for telemental health, and the whole thing was chucked because they weren't requirements, so we couldn't put it on there. Now, that isn't to say that speaking to someone new, that we may get a different answer. So I wouldn't say you shouldn't ask the question, just that it may not be an option.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe they could come up with language that they would want us to say that it excludes them from being, defining an opinion.
Right.
In the past, KNSW has provided various kinds of cool toolkits like that too. So it might be something that we could ask them to, and then they could just be referred. New practitioners that might need to learn about how to set up their crisis plan, could be referred to the KNSW.
Will they require them to be a member to release it?
I don't know that. I don't know the answer to that. That I could find out.
Well, and I have, my thought is that if somebody's in private practice, they're either the member of an organization under the supervision of somebody that's been in practice for a while, or they're probably a member of an organization that's going to have these policies in place. So is it something that we even need to regulate? Because new practitioners will be under the supervision of somebody. And that supervisor would be the person providing those toolkits, or at least I do with the people I supervise. One of the first things we talk about is what do you do in a crisis? So I don't know that it's necessarily something that we have to get too worked up about, and because if there's good supervisors out there, they're providing this anyway.
But that's the point. If there's good supervisors out there, and there aren't always. I mean, we have some, I think plenty of examples of where people have not gotten adequate supervision in that regard. They should. You're right. Anybody either in private practice or that's working on their clinical license, or anybody in an agency should be getting that kind of supervision. But I don't think it happens uniformly. But the basic idea of having just an unprofessional conduct standard that says no matter where or how you practice, that you need to have a crisis plan for your clients who may be in crisis.
Maybe Cynthia, like a state, like the state or regional or community, like the levels of contacts that maybe they need to make sure they cover would be an easy way. So then that way it could still be original to what your location is, but overall you have some overall, guidelines that it's not just, a basic I mean, just, some, just kind of like basic things that people need to make sure they look at each level of the system on how they can get as close as contact with like a response team or somebody who could respond.
Yeah.
Are you thinking about that being in kind of the toolkit that we were talking about
No.
versus in the standard?
In the standard.
So do we want to define, I thought I was hearing we wanted a more general regulation that didn't say specifics about how the plan should be
I'm not
set up.
saying specifically what they have to pick. It's just the fact that you just make sure that you have like the 988, because we do have a new crisis mobilization in the whole state of Kansas. Why aren't we, making sure people know about it? And things like that. So anyways.
Sorry to interrupt you. I might have to jump in. We're getting pretty close to the end of time.
Yes,
I think
we are.
have just a little bit less than 10 minutes. This is a wonderful conversation. And I think since we're going to be talking about more with the unprofessional conduct regulations, and this is under the same umbrella, maybe we should revisit this the next meeting. There's another couple topics I want to make sure we have a chance to talk about today. So
Okay. All right, we will continue to be continued. I think we're close to an idea on this one, but we'll follow it up next time. So do you want to jump to the ones that you want to make sure we cover? Is
Sure.
this old business or new business?
This would be old business 5C, and I already kind of discussed this. This would just be a new item that potentially could be added to the continuing education regulation 102-2-4A that would allow sometime each licensure period to count for continuing education if practitioners were mentoring or coaching individuals that were struggling to pass the licensure exam, to be able to accrue continuing education hours. And I was thinking maybe 8 hours per license period, something either 8 or 10 or 5, but some number, just to encourage licensees. And some of them are probably already doing this, if they're mentoring someone who's struggling to pass the exam, but provide an incentive to them and to show our appreciation of those that are already helping those that are struggling with the exam, trying to pass the exam. So just wanted to hear your thoughts and see if you wanted us to pursue some language about adding language to the regulation.
I think it's a great idea. And I would suggest that the number of hours match the number of hours that clinical supervisors get for doing supervision in a period, a semester or whatever. I'm not sure. I don't remember how much that is. Leslie, do you?
I'll have to look it up. Hold on a sec.
Okay. Because it seems like, similar function.
But we also have to define how many mentor sessions you have, because you could mentor somebody one time on test taking things and then be like, oh, I need my CEUs, whereas you could spend several sessions mentoring. So you may want to define sort of a minimum standard. I believe it's 5 per semester CEUs if you're doing a student.
And you have to actually have seen them 5 hours to get that 5 hours. So I would suggest that it be a similar, they could get up to 5 hours if that's the clinical supervision standard, provided that they've or 3 hours or 4, depending upon how many hours they've provided, up to 5.
Who's going to issue the certificate?
So one thing that we talked about here, Leslie and I did, is perhaps the individual who's receiving the coaching or mentoring could just sign something attesting that they received that. And so that way, when if they get audited, they could produce that document that just shows this person received the coaching or mentoring.
Yeah, with the dates of the meetings.
You did say per semester. We're talking about per licensing period when you think the 40 hours. So it seems like there needs to be some number. Is it 5 for the 2 years? Is it 20 for 2 years? It seems.
Supervision of an undergraduate and graduate practicum students or specialty applicants. Yeah, shall not exceed 4 continuing education hours per semester. The maximum in a 2-year period shall be 16. So it would be in quarters or, however you.
But hopefully you aren't coaching someone for 2 years
Right.
before they
Yeah.
take the test.
That's true.
Hopefully they take it and you coach them, for 1 semester and then they take the test and pass it.
Yeah, but you could be coaching 2 or 3 people in a 2-year
Correct.
period.
Right. So with those with that kind of a limitation, based on the actual number of hours that you're providing and with a cap, such as they have for other forms of supervision, what does everybody think about that go, Andrea?
I agree with that. I think going along with Mike's point, if we could make the language match, and this probably was already said, but just make the language match to within a 2-year cycle instead of using the semester language, I think that'll be easier.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So 8 hours a year, maybe.
But, the only thing I'm going to say to that, I was kind of thinking more like if we went 4, because then it'd be an 8-hour. But by the time you put your ethics in and by the time you put your diagnosis and then you get some other training, it doesn't take much to get 40 hours. And that other training is just as important with some of it. I'm not for sure I'd go beyond 4 hours a year where it would be 8 hours in 2 years. Because anybody that does this is going to be appreciative just to have those extra hours toward their licensing. But adding all those hours up, they go fast to get 40 hours.
David, what was your and Leslie's original thoughts on the max hours?
Originally, we were considering 8 hours or 10 hours, one of those two. It seemed like a pretty good number, but wanted to open up for discussion. So
Per year?
And that was 8 to 10 per the 2-year cycle, right?
for the license period, yeah, the 2-year
Yeah.
cycle.
I'm fine with 8 or 10. I think that's pretty reasonable and it falls within what Jane's kind of saying too.
I'm fine with 8 or 10 as well.
10 seems to be used more in the regulation. Maybe we should do 10.
I'm good with 10.
I am
Do
too.
you
Over
do
2
you
years.
care that it's 5 in a year, or is it just 10 for the whole thing?
I say 10 for the whole thing.
Okay,
Yeah,
great.
because
Thank
again, you
you.
might have 2 different people you're helping and one might need more
Right. Okay,
than
great.
the other.
Thank you.
10 in a 2-year period. Okay, so anyone want to make a motion that we,
I have one more question before we make a motion. So we don't really address group. Does the hour count or does the hour per person count? Like, let's say you got 3 people for a study group together. Are you just getting the hour or do you get 3 hours per
It's
hour?
hour for hour, not more if
Perfect.
you have more people.
the number of
Okay.
hours the supervisor or the mentor actually provides versus
Yeah.
how many people are getting that hour.
Yeah.
So
You might just get 3 signatures on that 1 hour. That's all.
Mhm.
true. If it's a group, I guess you'd have to get all the signatures, huh? So do we need a motion or can we do this by consensus, David?
Let's do a motion, just so we can have a vote on this one. So,
Okay,
Okay.
do I have a motion?
This is Leanne. I motion to put 10 hours.
10 hours CE credit for those who are mentoring or assisting someone getting ready for the exam
Right. In 2 years.
over 2 years. And do I have a second?
I second the motion.
Thank you, Eric. All in favor? Aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay. Good idea, David.
well,
When
thanks.
does this go into effect?
So this would need to go into the regulations. So it would be we're going to be making some other modifications to regulations, but then once it would be implemented, then we'd be able to start providing those continuing education hours. So can't give you a time frame. It'll have to go through, review by the Department of Administration and Attorney General's office, and there'll be an open comment period for 60 days, and it'll go before the Committee on Administrative Rules and Regulations, but we'll let you know when it's getting close. So.
Wouldn't this still have to go before the board first? Before, right?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yes.
the board will officially
February.
have to approve it, and so it'll come before the board at the next meeting in January. So.
All right. And was there a second thing you wanted to make sure we talked about, David?
Yes, and I apologize if you don't mind sticking on just for about 5 more minutes. Each of the advisory committees was asked to discuss the statute on reciprocity for the professions and to see if there could be any changes in terms of we have a general reciprocity statute, and I'm showing this to you on my screen right now. For the social work profession, it is 65-6322, and it outlines how individuals become licensed in Kansas through our traditional reciprocity statute. And it allows for the bachelor's level, master's level, and for the clinical level. The requirement that is consistent between the levels is that you have to have come from a jurisdiction that had substantially equivalent licensure standards, or you have to meet other qualifications. And what the qualifications say is that you have to have be practicing in another jurisdiction at the same level. So if you don't come from a jurisdiction that has substantially similar licensure requirements, substantially equivalent, then if you're licensed as, let's say, a bachelor level social worker in another jurisdiction, you have to have practiced in that jurisdiction for 48 of the past 54 months immediately preceding the application. You have to show a serious an absence of disciplinary nature, and then you have to show that you have a bachelor's level degree in social work. For the master's, the same is true, but you have to show a master's degree in social work. And for the clinical, you have to meet the requirements for the master's, and then you have to have either show that you are currently licensed to practice social work at the clinical level in another state, and you have passed the national clinical exam approved by the board, 3 years of clinical practice with demonstrated experience in diagnosing and treating mental disorders, or an attestation from a professional license individual to diagnose and treat mental disorders, an independent practice or license to practice medicine and surgery, stating that the applicant is competent to diagnose and treat mental disorders. The item I wanted to bring before you, there was a bill that passed last year that changed some of our reciprocity process. This was a bill that was for military members, military spouses, but it involved other individuals that live here in Kansas or intend to reside in Kansas. And what that bill said is that if you don't qualify for reciprocity through the traditional standard, and you fall into the category affected by that bill, you could come in through reciprocity if you practice in a jurisdiction that has a similar scope of practice and you practice in that jurisdiction for a year. And so using that bill, we've been able to help a lot of individuals come into the state of Kansas through reciprocity. But the difference between the reciprocity standard in that bill versus the reciprocity standard in the regular bill is very different. And the main difference has to do with practicing 48 of the last 54 months in your jurisdiction. So each of the advisory committees for the board is talking about their version of this reciprocity statute to see if that amount of time can be lowered or potentially removed as a requirement for reciprocity. And just to let you know, the Marriage and Family Therapy Advisory Committee has met, and they've made a recommendation to remove the length of time in terms of practicing in that jurisdiction. The addiction counseling profession, that advisory committee met, and they also wanted to remove the requirement of practicing for that length of time immediately preceding application. And the licensed psychology advisory committee met, and they wanted to reduce it to a year so that someone would have to practice 12 of the last 16 months in their jurisdiction. And so I think some of the other advisory committees are considering lowering the length of time someone had to practice in their jurisdiction. And so I wanted to bring it before you and to allow for some discussion in terms of if you were interested in making a recommendation to lower that amount of time concerning the reciprocity statute.
David, does the advisory committees that are voting to eliminate any time, does that mean that someone could have just gotten their degree and just got licensed in another state and would then be allowed to be reciprocally licensed here?
So
Well,
this
sorry.
has to be voted on by the board. And then if the board was supportive of it, it would need to go into a bill that would have to go before the legislature. And Leslie, were you commenting on that too?
I was gonna say yes. If so for the LMFT, if they were just licensed with their education and exam, the equivalent license would be the LMFT. If they had completed their postgraduate experience and passed the clinical level, then they would, as long as they're licensed, then they could get the LCMFT through reciprocity without any practice time after the license.
Yeah, so we've heard about individuals that practice in other jurisdictions that may have had a gap in service. And one of the issues with the current statutory language is that someone has to have practiced 48 of the last 54 months. So if they practiced 10 years and then had a gap and then came back, if that gap was over 6 months, they really wouldn't qualify under a reciprocity statute. And if they don't qualify under that special process of reciprocity through that military bill, then they wouldn't be able to come in through reciprocity. So the real thing individuals are talking about is that length of time. If that 48 of the last 54 months is still a good length of time, or if perhaps that could be lowered.
Good. I would recommend meeting the same amount of time and stuff that that military bill does.
And the military bill would say if you don't qualify under the existing reciprocity statute, it essentially would say we'll evaluate you for reciprocity if you practice in a jurisdiction that had a similar scope of practice and you had practiced in a year in that jurisdiction. There's some other requirements that have to do with an absence of discipline, but the main requirements are 1 year of practice and a similar scope of practice. So those are the two main requirements if you are seeking reciprocity through that military bill.
I think that would probably be a good one for ours because if they have the same testing and stuff as we do, because they should be able to get across anyway, be able to be licensed here as well.
I guess the question is if they have basically have met the same requirements. I'm looking at what you have posted here. It says substantially the equivalent of the requirements in the Licensure Act, but that I don't know how that's been interpreted up to now. And I guess I'm just wondering if substantially equivalent could include someone that didn't have as much experience getting their degree, not as much practice experience, in other words, as we do. Is there value in having people practice out in the field for a year post graduation if we don't know if they don't have to have had the same number of practice hours to be accepted as substantially equivalent? Leslie?
So for bachelor's and master's, substantially equivalent would just be a program that's CSWE accredited or equivalent and passing the appropriate level of exam. If you scroll down further for the clinical level, they have to meet, their state standards have to meet our LMSW. They have to have met at least the LMSW level of licensure. And then in addition, they submit 2 of 3 items to show clinical competence. So for clinical, it's a little bit different. They could, if they had, so most states meet substantially equivalent at the LMSW level. So then in addition to having the license, the LSCSW applicant would have to show that they passed the clinical exam or had 3 years of clinical practice after their LCSW was issued, or have an attestation completed by another person who can diagnose and treat mental disorders independently, and that person would attest to their clinical competence. So they would have to have 2 of those 3 things.
So the only thing we're talking about is reducing or eliminating the practice requirement beyond all that.
Right.
I like the alignment of the LCP instead of just totally taking it out. I like the fact that they reduced it to a year. and being more aligned with their discipline.
And just for clarification, that was the licensed psychologist advisory committee who had made that recommendation.
And it was 12 months out of the last 16, so you would have the same kind of issue that we've had with 48 months out of the last 54, that someone
Right.
could have had a break.
Right, how about at least a year of practice without disciplinary actions or complaints since licensure?
Yeah, and this language here, one of the requirements it talks about is the absence of disciplinary actions of a serious nature. So
Right,
I would encourage you to keep that in the requirements.
Right.
To make sure we have a check on the process.
right. But maybe a year's practice since they become a license, that way. And if they haven't had disciplinary, because they can't have the disciplinary actions and stuff, so that would attribute to if there was lapses in care.
Mhm.
So having practiced a year, so sort of a tryout in terms of, yeah, like you said, they wouldn't be able to have any disciplinary actions if they weren't licensed in the
Right.
first place.
So that way it wouldn't have, if they've had a lapse in being able to work or care for people, or if they've had some family emergencies that are unable to work, that would they would not put them so they're not eligible because they weren't able to practice at that point in time. As long as they had that year of practice.
Is it possible currently, I'm wondering if somebody has less than the required number of hours of practice, are they able to work and acquire the rest of the 48 months without being licensed? Is
Not
there
in-
some in Kansas?
No,
So whatever number we would land on in terms of years of practice, if they were short of it, they'd have to just start at the beginning to get licensed as a.
right. Or we could add, there's a provisional license that's an option if someone doesn't quite meet the education requirements, like they're missing a class. So you could add to that statute saying that the person could gain a year of experience while practicing on a provisional license in Kansas.
Oh, okay. So what do we think about that idea? Making it, dropping it from 48 months out of the last 54 to 1 year since you were licensed. And if you're short, you can practice on a provisional license until you acquire that year and then apply for full licensure.
That sounds good to me.
I think that removes some barriers to.
Yeah, because it would remove a lot of barriers, but still they'd still be accountable. So
Mm.
be able to see if there's any disciplinary actions or anything.
Anybody else have a thought? Is this something we need to vote on, David?
Yes, if you're ready to make a recommendation, a vote would be helpful, and then that way we could forward this to the board. And this would be a statutory change, so it would be something that would need to go to a bill for the legislature. So.
Are we ready to take a vote on this? Does anyone want to consider further or take it up next time?
Well, and
Okay.
if it was discussed next time, it would be too late for it to go into a bill, most likely. So, yeah.
Right, so we'd be waiting a whole nother session.
Okay.
So do I have a motion then to make that change of dropping the 48 out of the last 54 to 1 year since licensure, total, not necessarily 12 out of the last 16, and to add that if you are short on those hours, that you can get a provisional license to complete those 100 hours while you are.
This is
Looking
Leanne, I
into-
make that motion. That
So what?
I make the motion, we go 12 months since licensure, and that they can make up those hours with the provisional license and drop the 48 out of 54.
Yeah, I support that motion.
Thank you, Mike. Any other discussion? All in favor, aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, looks like it's going to the legislature. Okay. All right. Yes. Thank you all for staying a few extra minutes. We got through most of our old business anyway, so we'll pick up the rest of it at our February meeting. In the meantime, I hope everyone has a wonderful holiday and stay warm because it's going to be really cold in a couple of days.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Merry
Meeting is
Christmas,
adjourned.
everyone.
Merry
Yes.
Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
Take care.
right.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.